Okay, everybody, this is how European settlement happened in New England, Part 1. Now, we had previously looked at, if you look at the color coding here, the Chesapeake colonies, located right here in green, near Chesapeake Bay. But now what we want to do in this one is take a look at how the New England colonies were settled. And if you look at the color coding, those are located right here. So the tutorials for Part 1 and Part 2 will both deal with the settlement of this region. Now, ironically enough, in order to understand settlement in New England over here, we actually have to go way back in history to Europe, even before the time of Queen Elizabeth. Remember, we had mentioned that Protestants and Catholics had numerous problems with each other throughout English and Spanish history, and even within the boundaries of England itself. But we never really got into what their beef actually was. So why did they have problems with each other in the first place? Well, that begins with what became known as the Protestant Reformation. Now, the Protestant Reformation begins in 1517 with a Catholic named Martin Luther. Now, Luther had been watching a church official named Johann Tetzel go around and essentially sell plots into heaven. If you give money to the church, I, as a church official, will guarantee your spot in heaven. Now, that really set Luther off, and he started to look at some of the other practices of the Catholic Church and decided he was going to protest those actions. That is where you get the word Protestant from. The first part of the word Protestant is protest. What were the things he didn't like? Well, specifically, he didn't like this idea that people go to heaven based on good works that was being promoted in the Catholic Church. He felt that you were already going to heaven by the grace of God, just don't screw it up. I mean, you could screw it up, but you didn't earn your way there. You were already going, and your job was to just not find your way into hell by screwing that gift up. He also disagreed about the status of Mary. In the Catholic Church, Mary was being presented as kind of a co-redeemer of the world with Jesus, and people were praying to her. Luther said that he didn't think people should do that. He also didn't agree with the concept of purgatory, which was kind of like a middle ground between this world and heaven. Maybe you hadn't done quite enough to get to heaven, but you were getting close. And he didn't think that existed. And finally, he didn't believe that priests and popes should interpret the Bible for people. He believed that the Bible was very literal and that you should just interpret it for yourself. Well, surprisingly to Luther, this spread across Europe like wildfire. It turned out there were numerous groups that were willing to protest the actions and beliefs in some ways of the Catholic Church, and all of these groups would eventually become known as Protestants, those who would protest the actions of the Catholic Church. So there were really only two types of Christians, Catholics and those who were protesting Catholic actions. Now, these would include a lot of denominations like, Lutheran, started by Martin Luther, Calvinists, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, eventually Methodists, Baptists, etc., etc. Now, after Martin Luther, one of the most prominent Protestants was John Calvin, who in 1536 elaborated a little more on Luther's ideas, but did so in a much more somber, severe, and harsh fashion. His ideas would be known as Calvinism, and this would eventually become the theological preference for Scottish Presbyterians. I mean, it's just basically, Presbyterian is Scottish Calvinism, French Huguenots, the Dutch Reformed Church, and the Puritans, who would eventually settle in New England. That's why it's so important that you pay attention to what we're talking about right now, because when we eventually study Puritan culture in New England, I want you to remember these facts as the basis for their thinking that they built their society on. Now, Calvin argued that God was all-powerful and all-good. And that was also what Luther had argued. But while Luther said that humans were born sinful and could screw up heaven by being evil and going to hell, Luther still said that they were going to heaven anyway because of the grace of God. Calvin took a much more severe approach to this, saying that humans were not born just sinful, but weak and wicked. Calvin also said that God was all-knowing, and that since creation, God knew who was going to heaven and who was going to hell. This was referred to as predestination. This was not necessarily something, or actually wasn't something, that Martin Luther believed in, but Calvin did, and Calvinists still teach this today. Those who were predestined by God to go to heaven, even before they were born, were referred to as the elect. Those who were going to hell were just going to hell. It had already been determined and decided. Luther didn't necessarily agree with this. Luther said that you were saved by the grace of God, and he did say that you could screw it up and make your way into hell if you rejected the grace of God. But he didn't say that people were selected beforehand. While Luther didn't believe you could earn your way into heaven, Luther's belief was that you were all, by the grace of God, selected to go to heaven to begin with, and it was kind of up to you not to screw it up. Calvin was teaching that the elect, even before they were born, had already been selected to go to heaven, and others were simply going to hell, and it really didn't matter what you did in your lifetime. Calvin taught that doing good works couldn't save you from a predestined damnation. But the elect couldn't just live immoral lives either. I mean, they had to maintain their status. The problem was this. If nobody knew, or the problem, according to the people who lived under Calvinism, was this, nobody knew if they were among the predestined elect or the damned. So they constantly looked for signs that they had received God's grace. And this was referred to as conversion, getting signs that you had been one of the elect. This was a deeply personal experience, and if God revealed that you were among the elect, then you were expected to be a visible saint to the people, leading lives of holy behavior in a sanctified sense for everybody to see, based on the signs you got from God that you were among the elect. Again, if you got these signs, then that was known as conversion. Now, this was nothing that Martin Luther was teaching, and frankly, nothing that the Catholics were teaching either. But again, when we think ahead to New England settlement, these ideas are part of the basis of the Puritans that would eventually go there. Now, while Calvinism was starting, Henry VIII, the King of England and Elizabeth I's father, remember, we've already talked about Elizabeth I, but we're going farther back in history, Henry VIII was breaking ties with the Roman Catholic Church and placing himself as the new head of the Protestant Church of England, also known as the Anglican Church or the Episcopalian Church. Henry VIII was actually willing to keep some of the Roman Catholic practices that he was breaking away from. His church was considered pretty inclusive, but his action prompted some to demand a total purification of English Christianity. No Roman Catholic practices at all. These people were known as Puritans. Now, the Puritans felt like this process was happening far too slowly, and some felt that only the elect, the visible saints who had experienced conversion, should be allowed church membership. That was a problem because the Church of England admitted everyone. So, as far as the Puritans were concerned, the elected saints who had gone through conversion and gotten signs from God that they were predestined to go to heaven and be role models for the rest of society, now had to share pews and communion rails with those they considered to be the damned, those predestined to go to hell. And to the Puritans, that was completely unacceptable. Okay, so let's review here. Originally, you had the Roman Catholic Church, and then Martin Luther protested the things that the Roman Catholic Church was doing. This led to a denomination called Lutheran, the original Protestants. There were other Protestants that formed as well. A lot of other churches reformed their beliefs, and this led to a denomination called Presbyterian, which is really Scottish Calvinism. There were a lot of other denominations that formed in this way as well. One other group of Protestants in England, under Henry VIII, formed the Church of England, also known as the Anglican Church or the Episcopal Church. Now, they still allowed a lot of people in and included some Catholic practices. And a lot of the people who went to the Church of England, those who considered themselves the elect through conversion, didn't want to share pews with those who were the damned. The elect, after all, were the ones who were supposedly going to heaven. So they wanted to purify the Church of England, getting rid of the Catholic practices and getting rid of the damned. Some of those Puritans didn't feel like this was happening quickly enough, and so they separated themselves from the Church of England. And some of those separatists eventually came to be known as the Pilgrims. Okay, I just thought this was a cool picture, and now I'm just trying to make this thing more Batman-y than it needs to be. Anyway, remember, the Pilgrims were Puritans, wanting to purify the Church of England, and when it didn't happen quickly enough, they separated from the Church. So the Pilgrims technically are known as English Puritan separatists. Now, they fled to Holland in 1608 to escape the religious persecution from King James I. The fact that they wanted to make fairly radical changes in the Church of England was insulting to King James. He said that if they defied the Church, they essentially defied him. So they took off for Holland in 1608. But by 1620, they left Holland as well. They felt like Dutch culture was starting to become too much a part of their lives and that they were changing and losing their English roots. So they boarded a ship you may have heard of, the Mayflower, to the New World, led by this guy, Myles Standish, who gave a lot of orders, was kind of loud according to the historical records, and was short enough that they referred to him as Captain Shrimp. Originally, the Pilgrims were sailing for Jamestown or somewhere else along the Virginia coast. Remember, Jamestown had been settled in 1607, a year before the Pilgrims had even fled to Holland. But a storm blew them off course, and they ended up landing somewhere else that was completely outside of the charter they were given permission to go to. That place ended up being Plymouth. Now, initially, Plymouth is right here. I've actually been to it before, to the site of the original Plymouth plantation. What happened first is that the Pilgrims actually landed here. They didn't go ashore for any extended period of time. They took some boats ashore, explored a little bit, but they stayed on those boats for a couple of months, and then they sailed across Cape Cod Bay and eventually landed and formed the settlement of Plymouth right here in 1620. Now, the Plymouth colony became a little bit larger than just the village itself here, but the biggest thing that you have to understand about this settlement, in terms of its significance later on, was the Mayflower Compact. Please underline that in your notes. The Mayflower Compact was a government agreement that they had all signed when they were on the boat coming over on the Mayflower. The idea was that when they landed, there were going to be a series of Puritan-based laws that every one of them is going to agree to follow. This was one of the first governing documents in the New World. Now, the Mayflower Compact was a great advancement, and despite being blown way off course from where they were trying to go, they decided to stay at Plymouth and try to build the colony there, again landing in 1620. But only 44 out of 102 survived the first winter. None went back to Europe, but there were some thoughts of that. With their survival in question, they were very fortunate to actually befriend some of the local Native American tribes there. Two Native Americans, Squanto and Massasoit, helped them out tremendously with big harvests, giving them fur and fish, and of course the Pilgrims and the local Native Americans engaged in the first Thanksgiving Day in 1621. Now, this would not become a national holiday until the Civil War, but if you go back, it's really the first time that settlers had sat down in a major dinner, in a major celebration, to give thanks for all of the blessings that they had received. Pretty soon, because of Squanto and Massasoit and the effort of the Pilgrims, the colony would find a stable foundation. Now, a lot of this is due to probably the best leader the Pilgrims ever had, William Bradford. Bradford ran the Plymouth colony for 30 years, and probably his most notable achievement is the fact that they didn't lose any of their Puritan ideals. As more people were coming from Europe that were non-Puritans, and as those people started establishing settlements around Plymouth, Bradford maintained the Puritan lifestyle, even with those non-Puritan settlements forming around them. The quaint, quiet colony of Plymouth, which had a population of about 7,000 at its peak, would maintain its independence in this way for 71 years before it would eventually join the much bigger Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1691. But what was the Massachusetts Bay Colony all about? Well, that's for part 2. Thanks for listening.